everyone, it's me, Lois, with Aussie Lassie Knit Designs, and I'm coming to you today to talk some more about knitting gauge in the knitting pattern. So I mentioned yesterday that it's not always necessary to get row gauge as much as it is necessary to get stitch gauge, and that it's true that typically if you need to get row gauge as well as stitch gauge, that it will say something along the lines of it is necessary to get row gauge, but not always. And there are some clues that you can look for to see if you need to worry about that row gauge. So if you are knitting from a pattern that tells row or round gauge, if you are knitting from a pattern that that says knit for 8 inches and then do something else, then you probably don't need to get row gauge, because no matter what your row gauge is, you can just knit for 8 inches. If it says something along the lines of knit 14 rounds and then, begin crown shaping, well, then you do need to worry about your round or row gauge, because it is part of the measurement that's going into the pattern. And so those are some clues for you there. Usually if you're knitting like a blanket or a scarf or something like that, sorry, my dogs are, where was I? So if you're knitting something like a scarf or a blanket where it's just like a length, usually row or round gauge doesn't matter, because you'll just be knitting for 70 inches. Okay, so in that case, you could just go ahead and worry about the stitch gauge so you get the width, but the length part isn't as necessary because you're just knitting for however many inches that the pattern says. So where this can become an issue is if you're knitting, say, a sweater, and it does say something like, knit for 10 inches and then do this or that, because if there's any kind of arm shaping in the pattern, that tends to be row or round gauge measured, because it'll be increasing or decreasing, whatever it's doing, over a certain number of rows or rounds. And that is when it's more important that you know what your row or round gauge is and if it's close to matching. So anyway, so why that matters is if, let's say, you're really off on your row gauge for knitting a sweater, and then the shaping of the armhole requires that you meet that gauge, and you can know that by if it gives you a certain number of rows to complete that that armhole shaping. Then it becomes really important, because you don't want your armhole to be too big, right, or too tight, because that would be uncomfortable. And so row gauge is not always necessary. That's the summary. It's not always necessary, but there are some instances where you want to be sure that you're making it in order to make your object come out the way that it needs to turn out. All right, so I'll be back tomorrow and we'll start on a new section of the pattern overview. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, would you hit like, share, and subscribe? Thanks.